Shannon's Lumber Industry Update.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show, episode 137, and I'm featuring white oak this month. But let me throw a caveat into that. I'm kind of talking about the oaks in general because you can't really just say white oak. White oak is, well, it is a species, Quercus alba, but it's also a commercial trade name for an entire genus. Not quite a genus. I mean, the genus Quercus is what oak falls under, but like a subgenus, the white oak group. And the white oak group, it sounds like a financial, like a hedge fund or a mutual fund or some sort of financial advisor, the white oak group. I guarantee you, if you Google the White Oak Group, you'll find some sort of like financial advisors somewhere. I must not be making that up. I must have done that at one point. Anyway, the White Oak Group, well, let's just look at it this way. Oak can be separated really into the White Oak Group and the Red Oak Group. And I'm going to focus on the White Oak Group, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Red Oak Group and specifically how to tell the difference between the white oaks and the red oaks. But the real takeaway to this is if you're buying white oak or you're buying red oak, there's every possibility you could be buying any number of different species. There could be 10 different species showing up on the rack at your local retail lumberyard or even at your wholesale lumberyard. And the good news is unlike some of the other conglomerate species out there, like the mahoganies of the world, the differences between one white oak species and another white oak species and one red oak species and another red oak species is not really that dramatic. You'll find some outliers, but for the most part, you're going to have a hard time telling them apart, and you're not really going to have any difficulty or any differences, I should say, in how they work. But that's all to come as I move into the featured species. As usual, I'm your host, Shannon Rogers, and I love to hear from you guys. I'd love to hear your questions. I'd love to know what's on your mind. And certainly as a follow-up to this episode, if you have any questions about the oaks or have had any experiences with the oaks, whether it be in felling them, working with them, etc., I would love to hear about it. And with that in mind, I want those questions. If you go to lumberupdate.com, there's a form you can fill out there to submit questions. You can also just email me at lumberupdate@gmail.com. Stalk me on Instagram at lumberupdateshow. And if you really want to be one of the cool kids and sponsor the show, go to patreon.com/lumberupdate. And you too can be a sponsor. And since I'm doing a featured species today, you could get this fancy white oak sticker. Anybody who sponsors the show at the walnut tier in the month of November is going to get this sticker. But I did want to get into some of the news. I've gotten a couple of interesting articles across my desk in the last couple of months. And one of them is actually pointing to a YouTube video that talks about these kind of weird thumbprint from Google Earth. You can see these kind of thumbprint looking forests in Uruguay. And it's one of this, it's somewhat sensational YouTube channel. Actually, I say that and now I can't even remember what the YouTube channel is. I've seen a couple of his things. Vox, yeah. It's a, kind of sensational journalism type channel where it's full of some clickbaity stuff, but ultimately well made, well researched. He goes down to Uruguay in search of these forests that he found on Google Earth as a way to find out why does it look like a thumbprint. And what he actually uncovers is a story about afforestation. And if you don't know, deforestation is when we cut down a bunch of trees. Afforestation or reforestation is when we replant those trees to oppose the opposition of deforestation. Afforestation is when we actually take land that wasn't already forest land and turn it into forest land. So the country of Uruguay has actually done a fair bit of afforestation where they have discovered they need additional land. And let me pause on this for those of you listening to the audio. I'll do my best to describe what's on the screen right now. But it's a line graph that shows Uruguayan forestry production since 1970 until 2020. And it climbed to about 5 million cubic meters in 2019, and then had a steady drop off in 2020, obviously because of COVID. And then since COVID, it has skyrocketed from below 5 million cubic meters to in 2020 topping out at more than 25 million cubic meters of forestry production. And it's like, where does this come from? Certainly, if you reforested and planted a bunch of trees, they wouldn't have grown back that fast in order to be harvested over that amount of time. Maybe they had a whole bunch more going on before that and they were just getting to a harvest, but this is a sizable amount of increase in cubic meters of lumber. And what it comes down to is they just reclaimed, I shouldn't say reclaimed, they claimed more land for forests, land that was some other purpose. And there's several different case studies where the land was used for cropland. Other times it was just kind of barren open field land that they were able to plant forests in. This is afforestation. And this video does a really good job of talking about the process, talking about, spoiler alert, there's not really a lot of reason for the thumbprints. It just kind of happens based on afforestation following the topography of the land. And the reason that thumbprint looks a little bit like a topographical map is because that's what it's doing. It's following the topography of the land. But what happens is this story evolves into the monoculture issue, where we have reclaimed a bunch of land to plant forests. And what has happened is it's cropland. It's specifically being created for cropland, in some instances for pulp, other instances, well, this is a variant of eucalyptus. Some of you may be familiar with the product Red Grandis. Red Grandis comes from this neck of the woods, from Uruguay and Paraguay. Red Grandis is a plantation-grown monoculture forest. And it is particularly interesting. This is a purpose-built forest for a specific product. It is grown and harvested for a specific product, not unlike the 2x4 forests that you find in a lot of northern Michigan, where they're growing a certain number of years and then harvesting specifically to make 2x4s. And then there's another section of forest that's grown specifically to make 2x6s and 2x8s. And they're growing those trees over a longer period to get a larger diameter trunk and essentially cutting, couple of 2x6s and a couple of 2x4s out of each trunk. The turn rate is faster for the narrower boards, but they're able to replant and grow specifically for that purpose. Well, what's happening here is you've got some that's being grown for pulp, some that's being grown for specific lumber purposes. But the dark side, and so let me continue this. It's all well and good. You can afforest land that previously didn't have a use and create a sizable export and do a lot for the economy of the country, create jobs. The recycled, reusable nature of these forests sounds all really, really good. But the dark side of this is the monoculture forest. And there are certainly good ways to do this. But this is one of the things that we talk about, the danger of clear cutting and then broadcast seeding a specific forest, is we can end up with these forest lands. And if you look at the video, and I'll do my best to describe it for the audio, there's a bunch of eucalyptus trees growing, but if you look at the ground, it's totally barren. The only thing on the ground are the shed bark and things from the eucalyptus trees. There's no grass, there's no understory, and they talk in the video about how the forest is utterly quiet. There's no birds. There's no insects buzzing and things like that because the monoculture nature of this forest does not promote diversity in this stand of trees. And it could end up, in some ways, denuding the soil over time. This happens in, I want to say cropland, but this is how these trees are being harvested as crop. We see the same thing happen with tobacco during the colonial period in North America. Tobacco was a total cash crop, great return on investment, but it for all intents and purposes, salts the earth. You grow tobacco in a certain area of land and you can't grow anything else in it for many decades after. I don't know, we'll call them enzymes, byproducts in the soil from the tobacco plant, make it impossible to grow things like corn or soybeans or anything like that. I do believe that we have found crops that can be rotated into tobacco land these days, but tobacco is kind of persona non grata anyway, that we don't get a lot of effort going into that. But these monoculture forests are doing the same thing as tobacco. They are, for all intents and purposes, making it impossible to grow anything else. And this video goes on to talk about how the lifespan of this monoculture forest can be a bit of an issue because at some point you can't regrow the eucalyptus that's on there. So there are two sides to every story. This is a great use of land, a great use of land that didn't have a purpose before that is now producing revenue for the state and is producing paper products, pulp products, and lumber products. But there's got to be a happy medium in there. So I want to throw this out to somebody. I've spoken with several silviculturists, several concession managers. I'd love to hear your take on the monoculture forest, and more importantly, what we have learned to kind of prevent this going too far and how we can possibly introduce some biodiversity into these forests and what the silvicultural method is. I've certainly talked about silviculture before, but this is going to be my opportunity to throw it out there and say, if anybody is interested in sharing their perspective on this, I'd love to know. Reach out to me, lumberupdate@gmail.com, and I'll get you on the show. Anyway, let's move back onto some different stories that go in a totally different direction. Jason sent this article to me, and I find it kind of fascinating. Oops, we're talking about red oak there. Red oak has just been nominated or awarded by the U.S. military as the new species for truck beds. They've been using cruing, or apatong as is sometimes known, for truck beds. This is widely used for commercial truck beds because it's a super, super hard, durable wood, but it also grows very, very long and very, very straight. Well, now the U.S. military, in an effort to not be bringing in exotics and doing more domestics, is saying we're going to use red oak. I have some issues with this in the fact that red oak is not a good exterior species, but at the same time, the U.S. military is probably okay with that because it's going to go through such wear and tear, from the obvious, having bombs dropped on it, to just, everything military grade is highly durable. And oftentimes these truck beds are getting replaced a lot more often. So buying a commodity product that's frankly really cheap and widely available from coast to coast could be a solution for this. Certainly, you're not going to get the lengths you could get in cruing. You're not going to get the durability or the weather resistance that you get in cruing. But if you're able to splice and do butt joints in those truck beds, this could be an interesting solution. And part of me wants to applaud the U.S. military for sourcing domestically for this. And part of me wonders, is this wasteful? Are we therefore going to be replacing the truck beds more often? I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know how often they're replacing these truck beds, but we'll just look at it as a good thing. The way the USDLA, the Defense Logistics Agency, I used to sell to the government. So I speak TLA, three-letter acronym, fluently at this point. So I will be curious to see kind of how this plays out and what this does to the red oak market, which is currently quite depressed. Moving on, this is not a brand new story. There is a World Expo coming to Osaka, Japan, and it's kicking off next year. So there's been construction for quite some time. And the plans for this, what are they calling it? The Grand Ring. Super fascinating construction project here where they're building this giant ring out of yellow cedar, all local Japanese woods. Some of it is glulam, some of it is crosslam, and a lot of it is solid timber. But the Grand Ring is, let me get it's just a big giant ring that is framed in a very Japanese style. It reminds me of like a torii gate or something like that. But from the air, this thing is enormous. The timber is all domestic, Japanese cedar, Japanese cypress, and a little bit of European or Scots pine. It's about 60,000 square meters. The inner diameter is, let's see, hold on here. So it goes up to 20 meters high. That's where the skywalk that runs around it. And it is, what is it? The total length of it, when you walk around it, is 2 kilometers in circumference. And I've been talking about mass timber for a while and how exciting mass timber is, but also how this has all been locally sourced. Japan and their forestry is another triumph. I've featured it on the show before, but being able to source all of this material 27,000 cubic meters of wood to create this. And I don't know, I got to somehow figure out how to get to Osaka next summer to check this out, because what an amazing, of course, it's going to be there for a long time to come, but what an amazing construction project, but also sourcing project. And frankly, good use of glulam and CLT, mass timber in general. So anyway, those are a couple stories that ran across my desk, and I wanted to highlight them as much as possible. Let's move on to talking. First, let's talk about white oak as our featured species. And I've got a lot of experience working with white oak. A lot of the hobby woodworkers and furniture makers that listen to the show would probably say the same. But so would all the commercial professional woodworkers, home builders that listen to the show, as well as many of the architects that listen to the show. White oak is immensely popular. It's easily sourced from all over North America, and in the generic market term white oak, all over the world, because the stuff grows in Europe as well. Different species than what we generally have over here, but similar working properties. And white oak is ridiculously popular right now. With a but, and I'll get into that a little bit here. But in general, what is white oak? White oak is a nice kind of light brown wood. Most people will tell you that white oak has a slightly olive cast to it as compared to red oak that has a slightly red cast to it. Honestly, you don't want to tell the difference between white oak and red oak just by looking at the color, because that can be incredibly misleading. The thing that I usually look at most when I'm talking about the working properties of wood is the Janka hardness. So white oak is going to be about 1350, and I liberally use the word about because of the number of species you're going to run into in the white oak group. Red oak tends to be a little bit softer, around 1250, but there again, that can vary depending upon the species, this exact species you're using, but also just, growing conditions. In general, I find that white oak works a little sweeter than red oak. And I think that's due to slightly higher density, but also just a little bit tighter grain, more homogeneous feel to red oak. The other issue I find with red oak and working not as well as white oak is red oak can actually be difficult to dry and is often dried too quickly, has a lot of problems. Air-dried white oak and green white oak is an absolute joy to work with. I've used it a lot in building Windsor chairs, riven straight from the log. It is a transformative experience. I know Peter Follensby has spoken a lot about how the red oak that he knows is totally different from the red oak that most people complain about. The red oak at Home Depot, frankly. White oak, similar, it's going to work a little bit more, it's a little bit sweeter to work with in an air-dried and certainly in a green format like any wood would be. But I do find that from a kiln-dried perspective, white oak is definitely the winner as far as workability, ease of work, etc. Red oak can be quite splintery when it's kiln-dried, and it does pose a lot of problems to creating tear out and splitting while chopping it, and again, just the splintery nature. White oak kind of avoids a lot of that due to just its slightly different structure, slightly larger medullary rays, and its slightly harder Janka hardness. Both species are pretty similar on the bending strength and the stiffness. It's high. I'm not even going to try to compare it to things. It's high. It's more than you're ever going to need. Movement-wise, similar. They're not actually particularly stable woods. And it's interesting because people talk about white oak, specifically quarter-sawn white oak, as a great solution for stable wood. But tangentially, white oak moves 10.5%, radially 5.6%, giving it a TR of 1.9. It is not a very stable wood. And look at any white oak on a lumber yard, and you'll see a lot of cupping, a lot of twisting in the raw form. This is one of the other reasons that makes both species a little bit more difficult to work, to dry. Red oak, by the way, is about 4% radially, and it's not as high tangentially. It's like 8.5%. But even then, that gives it a TR ratio of 2. like 2.1, 2-ish. So red oak is even less stable than white oak. And it is something, sorry, I'm looking up that number right now. 8.6 tangential and 4% radial. So 2.2 TR. Thank you, Wood Database. Yes, I have a Wood Database like bookmarked on every browser, everywhere on all my computers. So both species are quite unstable, and you will find that they can cup quite a bit and move around quite a bit. This piece of red oak was milled not too long ago, and it's already got a little bit of a cup to it. It's just a very common thing to find in red oak. It's going to move a fair bit, so just be prepared for that as well. White oak is a ring porous wood. Solitary pores and relatively large pores, not as large as red oak, but the big difference with white oak is it's stuffed, those pores are stuffed full of tylose, which is why white oak is an exterior species, can be used for cladding, has been used for cladding since before this was a country. Independence Hall, several of the buildings in Washington, D.C., all of Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg, most of New England is clad in white oak. It's a fantastic exterior species. And it's funny because as exotics have kind of taken over exterior trim and exterior cladding and everybody's using sapele and things like that, white oak has kind of fallen out of favor to the point where I know a lot of contractors who insist that white oak cannot be used in an exterior. But it's used for pergolas. It's used for timber framing. It's used for outdoor furniture all the time. It is an incredibly weather-resistant, durable species outside. Red oak is not, because red oak has even larger pores that have no tylose in them. In fact, one of the key ways to tell the difference between red oak and white oak is looking at the pore structure. Now, you need a good clean cut, and you need to make sure that there's no dust, so blow out the dust so that you're not mistaking dust in the pores for tylose. You will see when you blow out the dust, red oak is very obviously different. Big, wide open pores and like dark specks that you can see all the way through. In fact, you can take a piece of red oak, stick it into water and blow on one end and create bubbles on the other end. I've seen it done with an 8-foot long board before. Those pores run all the way through, which means the water wicks right up into it and the board will rot from the inside out. White oak, you can blow and blow and blow and you will not get bubbles because that tylose, nature's own silicone caulk, has filled all of those pores. And that's the key difference between them. White oak has that slightly olive cast to it, whereas red oak has that slightly red cast to it. But again, looking at the end grain is going to be the best determiner. Both species, I just dropped a bunch of white oak on the floor. Both species will present medullary ray fleck. Oh, there's a little glasses ring on mine, but this is a piece of white oak that's got a fair bit of ray fleck. Ray fleck is really what gained white oak its fame during the arts and crafts period. The Stickley people did nothing but quarter-sawn white oak for everything. Rift, red and white oak will have a beautiful straight pattern. So I'm showing a wide piece of white oak that goes from quartered on one side of the board into a rift pattern and back into quartered. And technically this is all rift. So this is a very wide board. This is not like a center cathedral where you're going to have flat sun in the middle. This is rift and quartered on both sides of it, because essentially the entire board is quartered. If I look at the end grain, you can see for the most part, the growth rings are running nearly straight up and down across the thickness. As it starts to move a little bit into the diagonal, kind of closer to 45 degrees, I have rift. And that's how this board presents. Straight grain in the middle and ray fleck on either side. The ray fleck, the rays, I should say, if you look at a flat sawn piece of white oak, the rays will be about 3/4 of an inch and longer. The red oak rays will be a 1/2 inch, maybe up to 3/4 of an inch. That's another way to tell it apart. It's not nearly as conclusive as looking at the end grain, but the pores in red oak the rays in red oak present shorter on flat sawn. Going into quartered, it just depends upon the grain orientation. Some white oak has big, giant, fat medullary rays. Here's a piece of white oak that's got big old giant, there we go, try to get giant medullary rays. I mean, that medullary ray fleck is like 6 inches wide and probably a half an inch, in cross section. But then you can also have really subtle ray fleck that, can present somewhat wider on one side of the board and really, really mellow on the other side. And a lot of that just depends upon the structure of the tree, how the growth rings are oriented to the surface, the amount of ray fleck. I talked about this in my figured episodes. The amount of ray fleck can be graded like veneer. This is a very high, dense amount of ray fleck on a board. This is, luthier grade if people made guitars out of white oak, although maybe they do. I don't know. But this could be a veneer grade white oak board. In the end, the market for white oak, and I should say red oak and white oak, it's one of the only species that is specifically stocked and sold in flat and quartered grain patterns. Something like African Sapele is sold very much the same way, but from a domestic perspective, while you can buy quarter sawn cherry or quarter sawn or rift sawn cherry, no one's really stocking it. It's more of just sorting through the pack and finding it. That is unless, of course, you have a lot of money and are willing to, pay the lumberyard guys to sort through it and find rift. That could be done, but lumberyards are not buying rift sawn cherry. They're buying a whole bunch of FAS cherry, and then in that pack, they're going to have some quarter, they're going to have some flat, and they're going to have some rift. White oak is now sold not only in flat sawn and quarter sawn, but in rift sawn. Not so much red oak anymore. Red oak is still sold in quartered and flat, but much less in quartered. And red oak is now primarily sold as a flat sawn or a mixed grain species. White oak still stands strong as 3 distinct grains, flat, quartered, and rift. And what's the most popular and what's the most expensive changes with popularity. Right now, in the late fall of 2024, rift sawn white oak is the hottest thing out there. Cannot get enough of it. And every designer, every architect out there is speccing nothing but rift. They don't want any ray fleck whatsoever. The problem with white oak is it doesn't take much. So perfectly, if you're looking at the cross section of a board and the growth rings are running vertical, straight up and down, perpendicular to the face of the board, that is quartered. You're going to get big, fat medullary ray fleck. If you go 80 degrees, from 90 over to 80, that ray fleck is going to peter out, in some instances, almost entirely, and go to rift. So the definition of ray fleck is 90 degrees, kind of plus or minus 10 to 15 degrees will give you quarter sawn. And rift would pick up down to 45 degrees. So that 45 degree grain is going to give you rift, and that 60 degree grain is going to give you rift. But different red oak boards are going to present ray fleck a little bit differently. And you can have a board with growth rings running 60 degrees to the face that is still technically rift sawn, but you're going to see some ray fleck in there. And the people who want that perfect, beautiful, clear vertical grain riven white oak, you may have to dig through a lot of wood to get it. So if somebody specs 1,000, linear feet of cladding, we'll just say cladding, 1,000 square feet of rift white oak cladding, you're probably going to have to go through 8,000 square feet of white oak to get that. And this is why rift has become so incredibly expensive, why the lead times have gone up, why the sawmills can't keep the stuff in stock. And oh, by the way, the quarter sawn is practically worthless now. In fact, flat sawn is selling for more right now than quartered is. Nobody wants the ray fleck. The one saving grace to white oak in this and red oak is they will always be the mainstay of the flooring industry. Used more than anything else in flooring, but flooring is a number 2 common grade game. You can get away with some mixed grain and short links and narrow links and, knot and an ugly backside and things like that. Red probably dominates more than white in the flooring market, but certainly white oak is gaining a lot of steam as a slightly higher priced flooring option. It is used all throughout cabinetry. Definitely in like retail fixtures. Go to any Eddie Bauer or someplace like that, Abercrombie, and you will find the fixtures the clothes are hanging on tend to be made out of red or white oak. Probably more red oak than white oak these days, but you will definitely see it used on a lot of retail establishments, office buildings, things like that. Cabinetry in general, it's used all over the place. Cabinet doors, face frames, over, red oak or white oak faced plywood for the boxes. Certainly the furniture industry still uses a lot of white oak, but more than anything, they're specifically looking for rift white oak, or they're buying mixed grain and they're sawing it to be rift and taking a thicker piece and cutting it at an angle in order to get a rift face. Or I should say riven faces, because when it's truly rift sawn, all four faces will show that straight grain look to it. Whereas in a quarter sawn, you're going to have ray fleck on the front face and the back face, and you're going to have a flat sawn look on the edges. You can't get a quarter sawn look on all four faces unless you adhere a skin and veneer all the way around that. You can get straight grain riven look on all four faces by getting that perfect, corner to corner grain flowing at 45 degrees. And that's how I do it. I will often buy a thicker piece of white oak and saw it at angles in order to get that rift piece out of that flat sawn piece or that possible quarter sawn piece. It's really one of the only ways to get it now. Until very recently, people were not stocking riven white oak. Not so much anymore. So it is a species that's going to be found from one end of the country to the other and all across Europe. And I will say the difference in Europe is it is European white oak, royal oak, brown oak, Quercus regia, Quercus robur. What they rebuilt Notre Dame with was Quercus robur, or brown oak, or European oak. It's still, you'll find that it's a little bit darker in color. The growth rings are going to be a little bit closer together just due to the wetter climate that is Europe. But working properties are going to be very, very similar between American white oak and white oak. Quercus alba is a species, but also in the white oak group, you're going to find things like bur oak, which will extend all the way into the Midwest. This is a piece of white oak, Quercus alba. This is a piece of bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa. Can anyone tell the difference? No. The only reason I know this one is because I know where the tree was when it was felled, and I know the guy who sawed it, and he told me it was bur oak. I could probably dig into the end grain structure and get really specific to positively identify it, but the point is there's going to be very little difference in the working nature of it. Also in the white oak group, we're looking at chestnut oak. I talked about English oak, Oregon white oak, obviously out on the West Coast, overcup oak, post oak, swamp oak. And we should actually say there's a couple there: swamp chestnut oak and swamp white oak. Very, very similar. But again, those are all in the white oak group. Whereas red oak, certainly we have Quercus rubra, red oak, black oak, California black oak, cherry bark oak, laurel oak, pin oak, scarlet oak, Shumard oak, southern red oak, water oak, willow oak, and probably 10 to 20 other species in both red oak and white oak groups that I'm not mentioning, that I haven't listed at this point. I know for a fact that I've worked with like 6 different red oak species and probably 3 to 4 white oak species. I can't tell the difference. The takeaway to this is I wouldn't get too caught up in it. I mean, if you're a total nerd like me, maybe you really want to know, and maybe you want to dig into identifying the differences. And maybe then once you know the difference, you can start to say, yeah, this works a little sweeter than that. This bur oak I like working with bur oak more than I do white oak. I think that's more like the placebo effect. You know that it's different, so therefore you think it works differently. I really haven't seen much case. I have seen several people who claim that chestnut oak works a little bit differently. And if I remember correctly, chestnut oak is one of the white oaks that does not have tylose in it. So it is not a good exterior species. Botanically, I believe they're grouped into red oak and white oak based upon the shape of the leaves. White oak has more of a rounded lobe leaf, whereas red oak comes to a point. Easy way to tell them apart there. In the end, both species are commodity species, white oak certainly has a higher price point attached to it than the red oaks. White oak has a more specialized market. If you want to get picky, you can buy it by the grain and pay a heck of a lot more. Red oak, we'll see. Now that the Department of Defense is, bringing in all their stuff, maybe we'll find that there's more reason for red oak's price point to go up. The fact of the matter is, even though the price points may climb for these materials, they will never really get that high because of just the sheer availability of it. It can be found anywhere in North America, practically, and across all of Europe. There are even oaks in Australia. Now, those are not in the Quercus genus, a little bit different, but still, you're finding oak all over the place. As a product, it is so readily available and sawn so sustainably that the price point will never really climb that ridiculously high. So ultimately, if you want to kind of hedge your bets and go with a wood that's going to be easier to work with, it's not going to give you as much headache, white oak is going to be the better bet. White oak, I find, provides just a finer look to it. If you're trying to make really high-end furniture, white oak is certainly going to get there faster than red oak. Both species are going to need to be pore filled if you want a smooth surface, but white oak, especially in the rift sawn, has caught hold of the contemporary design market in a big, big way. It's that woody brown natural look, but it doesn't have giant wide open, grain like red oak would have. And it can be pore filled to give you a nice, smooth, even mirror polished finish on it. You're finding white oak showing up in kitchens, flooring, interior paneling, all over the place, where red oak is still having some trouble grabbing hold of some of those markets and still kind of sticking into the mid-range furniture market because it's overly grainy, kind of open pored nature to it. I think white oak is the the snootier option of the oaks. But here again, red oak can be an amazingly different wood to work with if you're working it green or air dried. And if you're riving it, red oak is a wonderful species to work with. Steam bending red oak is, I find, infinitely easier than steam bending white oak. The density difference, the lack of tylose in the pores. But again, you wouldn't want to steam bend kiln dried either oak. But steam bending kiln dried red oak, while possible, doing it in green is a transformative experience. And shaping and riving that red oak with a draw knife, with a froe, etc., can be a wonderful experience. It's actually what turned me on the hand tools, was spoke shaving red oak and making a Windsor chair. Both species, and white oak specifically, has a totally separate niche market in building barrels for distilling whiskey and for aging wine. What do we call it? We don't call it fermenting. It's already fermented. Just aging, I think. Aging wine. You need the tannins in the barrels to create red wine. You need the tannins in the barrels to put your whiskey in after it's been distilled to create that kind of distinct whiskey flavor. There are several other alcohols out there that require oaken barrels in order to be the alcohols they are. Bourbons, aquavites, things like that. Actually, I'm not sure about the aquavit. I'm not really a big drinker, guys, so don't quote me on that. Though that reason in and of itself, with the amount of craft breweries and craft distilleries and craft wineries out there putting a stranglehold on the cooperage market, and you absolutely must use that species, white oak, to pull it off. And that's where swapping in chestnut oak may not be the right solution because of the lack of tylose in the pores. That alone has created some interesting trends in the white oak market. It continues, both species, I should say, continue to be mainstay in that furniture market and continue to be a species that just about every lumber yard in the U.S. has. And in speaking to my counterparts over in Europe, every lumber yard there has some variant of oak on their shelves. It is ubiquitous. Home Depot, from sea to shining sea, carries red oak. It might not be the best red oak because it's probably dried a little too fast. And yeah, I won't go into that. But yeah, it's one of those species that if you haven't worked with it, I'm going to be kind of shocked because it's one of the first species a lot of woodworkers pick up. It also tends to turn people off of oak when they work with the Home Depot specialties. You're not going to find a lot of white oak. I'm not going to say no white oak in Home Depot. None of the Home Depots near me have white oak. It's all red oak. So if you've had a bad experience with oak, it's probably been red oak. Buying red oak from a reputable hardwood dealer is going to be a different experience. I can tell you when I started working at McIlvaine and I started using their red oak, I was shocked. Properly dried red oak is very different than the stuff you're going to buy at Home Depot. White oak is still, in my opinion, going to outperform red oak, hands down. Unless, of course, it's riven and, air-dried, beautiful stuff that smells absolutely wonderful when you work it. Which brings me to the other point. Both oaks are going to have a pretty heavy smell when you're milling it. I don't think it's an unpleasant smell at all. It's just a very distinctly oak smell. You can walk in any lumber yard that's been milling oak and you can tell they've been milling oak. It's a very, very distinct smell to it. In the end, if you haven't had a chance to work with any of the oaks, choose white oak. But don't get caught up in exactly which white oak you're buying. If you can even determine it and have a lumberyard tell you which species it is, I would be shocked. But it is definitely a species worth adding to your repertoire. It definitely gives you that woody, grainy look that most people think of. Like if I went into an AI tool and said, show me a picture of wood, the grain that they give you is going to be oak in nature. It's been around in use for building, ships back in the days of wooden navies, all the way till today when people are still using white oak to build boats. It's used in furniture all over the place. It's used in flooring in just about every house in the world that has hardwood flooring. To the point where I almost didn't talk about white oak because it seems so generic and ubiquitous that do I need to talk about it? But when a wood is used so universally from one end of the globe to the other, and yet the forestry practice is still sustainable and infinitely renewable, that's a species that we should probably applaud. And if you haven't yet, go buy some white oak because now's the time. You shouldn't have any more questions about red oak or even white oak for that matter, and shouldn't need to get caught up in the various species. Just go and get yourself some white oak. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I will see you next time. Who knows what species or what topic I will talk about, but I'm looking forward to seeing you then.